It is. G'day, you're on the Insecurity Project with Jamin. It's a real privilege and pleasure to have you on the show today. I've got Greg Bellingham. Now, I say this all the time to anyone who'll listen, but I credit Greg as the person who's had most impact on my life and been responsible for more change. And even just this morning, he had me in tears, which is not difficult, but just his ability to speak straight to the thing that needs saying. And it's consistently in a way that he gives me language and wisdom that I haven't been able to access myself. So, and it's done that consistently over a long period of time. So I'm incredibly grateful for this man and super excited to be able to interview him again on the podcast, and specifically around the area of spirituality and the interplay of spirituality and insecurity, and more specifically the interplay of Christian spirituality and insecurity. Because and by the way, that might not be where you're at the moment. This might not be a conversation that immediately strikes you as relevant. So this might not be a podcast that scratches the itch that you need at the moment. But nevertheless, there are plenty of people who are suffering for not having this conversation, which is a big part of the intention of the Insecurity Project, is to end unnecessary suffering caused by unresolved insecurity. So I think the three areas I'd love to address this year with experts like Greg is spirituality, finance, and sexuality, because there's a lot of noise in those areas, but not a lot of wisdom. And so I observe lots of people within a Christian spirituality in a very small space and a very stuck space, and experience a lot of suffering and a lot of judgment and guilt because they're not quite sure how to get unstuck. They don't like their experience. There's something that's happened internally that's caused them to find themselves in a very small place. So I've invited Greg today to speak to that. Where do we start, Greg? It's a big subject, but a really important one. What's the lead-in question? What's your observations around some of the key things that would cause Christians in particular to suffer in their spirituality? Something that's very important to them, very central to them. It's what they want. It makes sense. But nevertheless, if they're really honest, it creates a lot of pain and unrest, and there's a bunch of stuff that doesn't work for them within their spiritual experience.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff just even in that question. So maybe even if we broke that question down into something that was more definable, we could maybe just start by saying, what is spirituality?
Okay.
And then we could expand that out and say, what then is a version of Christian spirituality. But probably we've lost sight of what the idea of spirituality is. And I think the simplest thing that I feel about spirituality is that it's about connection, which means that it's not, if we then express that in a deeper way, we could say Christian spirituality is about connection to God, the God that's revealed through the person of Jesus, the God that we celebrate in the church, the God that is consistent with the Old Testament, the New Testament, the progressive revelation that we have through the Christian scriptures, through the Bible, through the nation of Israel in the Old Testament, and who continues to make himself known in the ongoing process of people meeting together to worship, all that sort of stuff. Having said that, a lot of stuff then gets back-ended in on that. I mean, we just talked about, if we take the Old Testament and the New Testament, we're talking about 5,500 years of history, right, of human history. So we're going back a long, long way. And you can back into a lot of stuff. 5,500 years of history is there's a lot you can feed into it. But for me, when I break all that down, when I break down what I've received historically through my Christian spirituality, it's still arguing, it's still moving us towards this idea that there is a God that has revealed himself, and that you can actually have a connection to that God. You can be intimately connected to that God, but there's a purpose behind his will and his will for your life, or there's a purpose behind your life. There's an inherent value in your life, and all of that you can be intimately connected to. Right?
Great description and distinction around spirituality being connection. So then, I think it's useful to explore this idea of connection, because I would say lots of Christians that I talk to would have experienced connection 20 years ago, but if they're really honest, it's the connection that's missing. There's an ideology, there's a practice, there's a bunch of stuff, but the connection. So why? Where's the connection gone?
Well, I don't think the connection's gone anywhere, but I think it's really easy to substitute connection for a bunch of other things.
Right.
So it's easy to substitute connection for a moral code.
Right.
So my Christianity doesn't become. My Christianity loses its emphasis on an immediate relationship with God or with Spirit. It loses that spirit to spirit, deep to deep. It loses that, and it starts to feed into, say, Christianity is about doing certain things or not doing certain things. So a moral, ethical conversation. Like right and wrong, black and white, good and bad, in, out, of us, not of us. And we start to move into kind of, spaces of exclusivity. We are the people that do this. We're the people that baptize in water. We're the people that pray in tongues. We're the people that sola scriptura. We only believe in the Bible. We're the people that believe in the sacraments, And so it's easy then to, have an ethic around, if you do this, then you're one of us. And if you don't do this, you're not. And there's nothing, we could call that a Christian distinctive. There's nothing wrong with Christian distinctives, in and if they actually serve connection. So sure. I'm ambivalent about what people do in that regard, as long as it serves connection to God. If it just becomes a tribal distinctive, then it's not serving, and it's not serving that purpose of connection. Then we get lost in that. We get lost in the distinctive, not in the connection. Right?
Great. So I'm very pragmatic, as you know, and I want to have a conversation that hits the ground. And so one of the questions my brain goes to intuitively is why. So why would that be the case? Why would people exchange connection or let connection fade into the background and swap it for a moral code or a tribal set of rules? Why does that happen?
Yeah, 100%. So I think one of the first things that happens when you become a Christian is that you feel like you want to gather with other Christians. And so as soon as we start gathering with other Christians, we're going to go into an environment. We're going to go into a structure or some sort of form that houses, some fellowship or some intimacy or some community around the Christian. Now, you'll struggle to find a form or a structure that houses Christian community. We usually call that the church, the gathering, the ecclesia, the body. The ecclesia, the gathering, the body, the church itself as a form, as a structure, always is defined by particular distinctives, right? And our entry into intimacy with God is often connected to our entry into intimacy with other people. And you do that in a context. You do that in an environment, right? And those environments have, like all environments, those environments are agendered places. They have their own distinctives. So I go to church, and as soon as I go to church, someone says, "This is how we do this. This is how we do devotion. This is how we do Bible reading. This is how we do prayer. This is how we do, commitment to X, Y, and Z." And so it's really quick. It's really easy to think that. And especially if we tap into our instinct to belong, hang out with other people, one of our instincts is the desire to belong and feel connected to them. And so one of the first things I do is I go, and I might even do this in an implicit way, not even explicitly trying to, but I might just sort of think, how do I connect? How do I belong? How do I become part of this group of people? And if a whole bunch of people are doing a bunch of stuff, then I just go, well, I'm going to get on board with that. So I get on board with a whole lot of stuff. which might suggest that I start to uncritically adopt some practices, some ideas, some habits, some activities or ways of thinking and doing stuff, which just I pick up because that's how we roll, right? And I want to be part of how we roll, right? So when I first joined the church, one of the things that people said was like, well, we do this, and we don't listen to secular music, so
we don't drink alcohol.
We don't drink alcohol, We go to 2 services on a Sunday. We go to youth group on a Friday. We go to Bible study on a Wednesday night. And I thought, well, I want to belong, so I'm at Bible study on Wednesday night. I'm at youth group on Friday night. I'm at Sunday morning church, and I'm at Sunday night church. All of that was an uncritical download to me. It just happened because I wanted to be part of that community. Right? Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Again, I don't want anyone to feel like that's a bad thing.
No.
But the point is, when you start to do things and the things actually cease to or stop connecting you to source, then now you've got yourself a fully fledged religion.
Yeah. And then the suffering begins, because when you're really honest with yourself, it's not actually meeting the deepest need you have for connection. Well,
there'll be a honeymoon period where you'll be doing these new things, and it'll just be all new, and it'll be wonderful, and it'll be life-giving, and it'll be tremendous. And then it'll become a point of discipline, and then it'll become a point of, I'm doing this, but I'm not getting much out of it. But, I'm going to double down on be super committed and keep going, keep pressing, keep pushing. And you'll probably personalize a lot of stuff. You'll go, oh, mate, I used to get a lot of life out of this. Why aren't I getting life out of this? So you'll personalize it and think it's your problem. And there'll be an endless number of people that say, yes, it is your problem. You're not as committed as you used to be, or you don't read or pray as much as you used to.
You're not coming on Wednesday nights anymore.
Yeah, what's going on?
You need to
100%. Yeah. So there'll be a lot of people, there'll be a lot of custodians of the tribal methodology, the way. And you might double down and be a little bit negative about yourself and go, yeah, I'm not as committed as I used to be, or I'm not as passionate as I used to be. I've got to regain my first love, or need to go harder. And then after a while, and for many people, they do that for the longest while. And if they're really, really honest, they wake up one day and they go, I don't know if this is about me. I don't want to be negative. I don't want to be critical. I don't want to criticize the church. It's been a place of great life. But they go, I don't think this is about me. There's something here that is not connecting me to source, connecting me to God, connecting me to spirit anymore. Whether I've changed or it's changed, it could be that they've just progressed. But they stop personalizing it and they go, no. There's the form that I have is not serving the connection, the spiritual connection that I have.
And then, so one of the great challenges then within that whole framework is the lack of ability for honest conversations and for truth telling. So there's no real way to say that within the context of a local church. Just go, well,
no,
actually, this is how I'm feeling about that. That's a significant challenge. So then the suffering increases, because then you have to either lie to yourself or pretend.
And there's never an admission. Probably, if we said it in a if we could say this way, and it's not critical of any particular institution or pastor or structure. All forms are temporal,
right?
So like I had 3 kids, 26, 22, and 21. When they were under 10, they needed me to be a dad in a particular way. They needed my wife to be mummy, and I needed to be daddy. Yeah. And they needed to be present in a particular way. We watched a lot of Little Bear. We watched a lot of The Lion King. We watched Little Mermaid. Like I can go back and all these movies that we watched heaps of times, and games we played, and we played Uno. You know what I mean? But if I went to my 26-year-old, do you want to play Uno? He goes, no, not so much.
I think it's pronounced Uno.
Well, there you go. So it's been a long time. So I she doesn't need me to be that guy. You know what I mean? At 26, she needs a different dad. She needs me to have a different form, to be the guy that who is moved out of being a directive person in her life and is now an encourager, a supporter, a champion of the things that she wants to do in her life. Yeah, in essence, I'm the same guy. I still have the same essential function as being her dad. No one else can, in essence, be her dad. And I haven't changed. My thisness is, I'm still the same guy that I was, but I express that essence and thisness in a different form.
Sure, great. But often, I'm sure you'd agree, people get attached to form. They find a form that works, they know how to operate in, and then they keep driving that form forever.
Yeah, that's right. So that's the critical mistake, and that's a really good distinction, is that form is not forever. Form comes and form goes. It has to be fluid.
Sure.
If we lock it in, when we lock it in, that's the day that we start to create a dynamic of pain in our life.
Great. And this is why insecurity is such an important subject, because to me, the reason why anyone would lock in form, because they feel comfortable in that space. They know how to make sense of their life. They find their needs are being met in that form.
Yep.
So they feel secure about themselves
100%.
And insecure about being someone else.
Yeah,
so a parent might find that they have a measure of security in the form of having toddlers, but as their children grow older, they don't know how to evolve. They don't know how to let go of that form and grow to the next. Or a church leader might find great comfort in being very directive and discipling new Christians, but have no capacity to have mature conversations because that takes them into an uncomfortable space.
100%. And the Christian church is deeply flawed in that regard. We still have position on whatever your theology is, but we still have relatively unevolved positions on women and the role of women in the church. We still have half the Catholic Church, we have all the Catholic Church struggling under celibacy and the disaster that's been. About celibate priests and the impact that's had on the Australian society has been massive. We still have there's a whole lot of stuff that we still do, which at one point in time was totally appropriate, but at this point in time is not appropriate, does not work, is not life-giving, does not connect us to spirit, to God, to source. And yet, because it's pitched to us as fidelity to our tribe or fidelity to our church, we do it and we don't want to criticize it because we don't want to be negative. And so there's no vehicle for actually saying, I don't think that this really is working, especially if the thing that's not working is a tribal distinctive. If it's a church distinctive and it's how that church is actually identifies itself and presents itself to the community around, if it's a point of pride and if there's a point of historical significance to that, then people go, we can't let go of that. That's who we are. Right? And that's the second mistake, is that the form becomes the expression of who you are, and it's not who you are. I am my children's father, and I was their daddy in that particular regard. But my parental function or my parental role, it can move in and out of form all the time without being violated at all. But if I need to be daddy to a 26-year-old, then I'm creating a codependent, unhealthy relationship. And a lot of people probably do have codependent, unhealthy relationships with their churches.
Yeah, for sure. One of the ways that I think about the personal development journey is really the transition from child to adult.
Yeah.
So the child outsources all needs, all internal needs for significance, belonging, affirmation, love, connection to their outside world, because they don't really have the capacity to meet that internally.
No.
And it works okay for a season, but most people never work out how to then fill that void themselves. And so remain attached to external things, external roles, relationships, possessions. And it creates a massive amount of suffering, because it doesn't make sense logically to have to lie to yourself and suppress intuition and stop being honest when things aren't working. But you have to stay in that place, because that is your whole identity.
Yeah, I think it's really, it's a really easy thing to, as soon as and this is why I define spirituality as connection. As soon as we start to feel like we can do spirituality and not have connection, and we should be honest about connection. We're talking about connection with a divine being, an omnipresent person, Manifest as spirit. We don't have a physical Jesus here. When we talk about connection to that, it's never going to be like connection to my coffee cup. Do you know what I mean? It's gonna be much more esoteric, much more ethereal. Sometimes I'll feel like I've got my finger in the socket and it's like, and I'm zinging and I can sense God's presence and we can, feel close to God. And sometimes I'll feel, I sit down with a journal and I'll write and I feel like, oh, this is a direct letter to me. This is God speaking to me directly. Or I'll pray and I'll be like, wow, I was in, think of all the old terms. I was in the throne room of God.
Yes.
Like I was at the feet of God. Sometimes it'll feel like that, and sometimes it'll feel like throwing stones at a glass, at a ceiling, and everything's bouncing off, and I'm hearing nothing, and I feel alone, and I pray and get nothing. I read and it's dry. I have fellowship with people, and it's passé. It's boring. I try and sing a song or worship or do some act of devotion, and it just seems dowdy and boring. So we should say that when we're talking about spirituality as a connection, that's not a constantly zipped up current. It's a waving current. You know what I mean? However, you still maintain that spirituality has to be about connection, because as soon as it starts to become about doctrine, dogma, moral codes, tribal distinctives, as soon as it becomes about those things, we're going to get stuck in a form. Yeah, we're going to get secure in that. We're going to get certain about that. We're going to get exclusive about that. And then if someone, and because time alone will challenge a form, you don't need anyone to deconstruct form. Time will deconstruct form. We don't do it like the Wesleyans used to do it. We don't do it like the Anabaptists used to do it. We sure as heck don't do it like the first century Christians used to do it. Time deconstructs form. But if you're so attached to form that you have to hold on to that and you fight for that, and that has become your Christian spirituality, you're in a world of pain.
Yeah.
You're in a world of pain.
I was just thinking about when we first met and how tied to form I was. And you had some dangerous conversations with me, and some deeply challenging ones. And I remember some key books that you put in my hands, which troubled me. But it was all about that whole thing of it's not the form. It's the form serves a purpose. But form is temporary.
It is.
And I was sharing my journey with someone recently. A client asked me to tell a bit of my backstory, and I burst into tears halfway through the story. Again, evidence that it doesn't take me too much to cry. But it was about the joy of not getting stuck somewhere, not getting stuck to form, having this, to look back over the tapestry of my life and finding that there have been times where I've reinvented, let go of one form and found the next form, and then to be able to maintain a sense of authenticity and integrity about being me, but the best version and the newer version. So you've played a massive part of that. So I'm always very grateful. So what would you say is as a starting point for people who might go, do you know what, there is some suffering if I'm honest, and you're right, I've attached everything to form. Where do they start?
Well, probably avoid the negativity piece, right? And that's really hard because to some degree you're going to have to go. If we move from one form to another, then there has to be a delegitimization. There has to be a deconstruct of this form before we embrace another one.
So you're saying this is wrong or this is bad or this form.
So there'll be an element of that, right?
Sure.
Walter Brueggemann, in a book called The Prophetic Imagination, wrote about this beautifully. And he took the example of Moses bringing the nation of Israel out of Egypt. And he talks about the plagues and how the plagues were a deconstruction of the form that the Israelites were living under. They were living under Pharaoh, they were living under Egypt. Pharaoh was a demigod, a living god at that period of time. It was autocratic in the extreme. They were stomping bricks, subjugated slaves, had no real rights. So the first function of Moses and of Yahweh, God, with that group of people was to delegitimize Pharaoh. And so what all the plagues did is they said, Pharaoh's not really a god. He's not in control of locus. He's not in control of the Red Sea. He's not in control of food supply. He can't even protect his own son. Right? So there was a delegitimization of that form, which people talk about a deconstruct. And then there was a movement out of that into really a wilderness, into what's called the liminal state, a place where, well, I'm no longer there, but I don't know what the new form is, right? And there's a whole big conversation we can have about liminality and the limen in Latin was the threshold between one room and another. There was the door frame. So I'm no longer in that room, but I'm not in this room either. I'm passing through this betwixt and between state. So the first thing that will happen with you as you start to challenge form is that to some extent you'll need to deconstruct it, and it will need to lose its legitimacy to a point where you go, you know what, I don't think this is working for me. Now you can do that fiercely and as a zealot and want to bring down the house, in which case just giddy up for more pain. That's probably how you and I used to roll.
Oh,
you know, like I'm taking the whole thing down.
Oh, boy.
That's just a recipe for lots of pain. Or you can just really graciously and wisely say, this isn't working for me, and I need to be honest about that. And I need to be honest about that because if I stay here, there's that old joke, there's that old pastor's joke, and I loved it because it summed me up entirely, where the wife wakes up the husband, wake up. No, I don't want to get up. No, wake up, you've got to get up, we've got to go to church. No, I don't want to go to church. Wake up, we've got to go to church. You're going to be late. No, I don't want to go. They don't like me and I don't like them. Wake up, you've got to go. You're the pastor. You know, like that was my experience. I do not want to be here. And I'm not sure that anyone else wants me here, but I'm actually running the church, right? So this is problematic. But you still have to say, I don't want to wake up. I don't want to be there. But it's fair to say that. It's honest to say that. It's not an answer in itself, but it's a starting place for dealing with a form that's lost its vibrancy, or lost its life.
Yeah, and I mean, one of those 7 practices in deep change around insecurity and identity is pain. It's actually to stop pretending there is no pain and to stack the pain, and that honesty around this is actually not working. This is not working, and that's messy, and it's like, I think the real reason people don't want to listen to pain is because they know pain's going to ask them to do something they don't want to do, or they don't feel capable of doing. So if this form really is not working, well, what does that mean? My whole world, my whole social structure, my whole moral code, my whole identity is tied up with being this guy. I don't know how to be any other person. So how can I listen to this pain and say this is not a legitimate form? Because then I delegitimize myself,
100%.
which is why people don't listen.
Yeah, that's so true. I think that's exactly what it is. You know, you become an outsider in your own world, right? And you stand to lose a lot of stuff. In reality, you probably don't.
Right. You know, so what do you mean?
Well, you know, I keep going back to the analogy of the kids. You know, like I lose that element of being, you know, the big, larger-than-life dad, but I'm still dad. Yeah. It just has to wait until something else emerges. And that's why staying in a perpetual deconstruct, or staying in negativity, or staying in that place, there's a real risk of staying in that place that you die in that state. That you lose connection entirely, and then you can't find it.
And then if it's not this form, it's nothing. It becomes so reactionary.
And I've lost a number of friends to that. They've jettisoned their religion. They've jettisoned their spirituality because they made it too much of a maths formula. Right. 1 + 1 has to equal 2. But in spirituality, 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. In spirituality, all sorts of things happen. I remember the story of, I remember reading the Gospels where it's at the birth, you know, before the birth of Christ, you know, there's these promises made to Mary, and there's these explicit statements that, you know, and Mary stored that in her heart. You know, Mary pondered this in her heart. Things like, you know, he will be, you know, the King of Israel. He will, you know, like he will be this guy. He will save his people, blah, blah. And Mary listening to that, you know, the testimony of the wise men as they come and they honour Christ at his birth. And then I think of the Mary who stands in front of the cross and watches her son being crucified, and then having every right to say in that moment, It didn't happen.
Mm.
He didn't deliver. This isn't him being a king. This isn't him being honoured. This is him being utterly dishonoured. And so you go, you know, does she have the right? Does she have the right at that moment to? I mean, she has to be patently honest because her son's been crucified. She can't say, you know, she can't kind of you can't put a happy spin on someone being crucified. It's about as bad. It doesn't get worse than that, right? And yet,
Michael Bryan, he tries to put a positive spin.
yeah.
Sorry.
What was it? Crucifixion or whatever? Freedom, crucifixion. So she has to be brutally honest. But then the other dynamic of spirituality is that it will come to pass. It just won't come to pass in that way, right? And so this is a crucial part about moving on from form. It hasn't happened in that form, but it will happen. It just needs to transcend that form. It just needs to find another expression, and we just have to allow that to happen. So it doesn't help to rail. You do have to delegitimize. You do have to deconstruct. But you don't have to go to war with the old form. It has to be a gracious letting go. And I haven't been a master of that. I've been poor. But I've railed because I've been so invested in them that it's been really hard to let go. But when you can let go graciously, you do, and then you allow the breadcrumb trail to fold out. There's always a breadcrumb trail.
Yeah, for what comes next.
Yeah, what comes next, and the what comes next won't be a big thing. It'll be a little morsel of life, and you go and pick that breadcrumb up. And then you walk down the track a bit further. It'll be an emerging journey where the idea of emergence is I didn't get everything downloaded, but I got a piece, and then I got another piece, and then a reality, then another form started to slowly emerge.
I got friends that jettisoned one form. They kind of got this idea. It's not about form, and experienced this liminal space, this kind of wilderness. It's like I'm not there, and it's not that anymore, and I haven't found the new thing yet. And it's almost like they got scared in that space, and then they ran back even further than they'd come to find an even more secure, concrete, rigid form, because the uncertainty of having no form was so threatening every part of their being, that they couldn't survive it. They couldn't hang on and follow the trail. And
I've seen that too. And I think I started to mention and didn't follow through, but I've had friends who their spirituality was, because it was doctrinaire or it was dogmatic or it was based on an ethics or a moral code, or it was based on a set of beliefs. You know, if I do this, then it happens like that. And when you have a Mary situation where that formula breaks down, for some of my friends, they've just gone, well, that formula's broken, so therefore the equation is done and I'm out. Right? And that's not sufficient. Like for me, that's never been sufficient. It's like, okay, that equation doesn't work, but spirituality it's not an equation. It's a connection. And so if I can't find the connection through that, then I'll find the connection. I'm gonna hang out because for me, if you throw it out as if it is an equation, right? You're treating your spirituality like a maths formula, right? It's not. It's a connection. If I lose the connection there, I'll find it somewhere else, but I'll have to wait. It'll have to reconfigure itself in a particular way. And whilst I can delegitimize the early naive form that I had, I could never actually say that form didn't give me connection initially.
Yeah, sure. No, you're right.
Right? Like I can't go back on my naive early Christian experience and say, well, the church didn't do this, this, and this, because for the better part of the first 10 years, it provided everything. It was a wonderfully nurturing place. You know, and I'm talking about really rigid, fundamentalist Pentecostalism, you know what I mean? For me as a young 20-year-old, like, that was a good formula. For me as a 45-year-old, that was a really bad formula. But initially, it in terms of my own evolution as a person, I can't deny that played a major role in shaping my connection to God. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Such a useful conversation, and again, so glad we're getting to have it. You got a book coming out. This has been something that's been in the pipeline a long time. Yeah. I'd love to hear just a quick summary of this message, because this is a continuation of the things we're talking about here. Tell us the heart.
Yeah, so
what you're writing.
Yeah, the book that I've written is a book called The Hidden Faces of Change,
right.
The Not So Obvious Truth About Change. And it's really playing on some of these ideas. It's playing on the idea that, number one, that change isn't anywhere near as obvious as we think it is. You know what I mean? And that it's not just one thing. A lot of the time, change is defined as process, current state, future state, transition state. We've even toyed a little bit, departing form, emerging form. But I've personally found that change has probably 5 faces.
Okay.
It sometimes comes to us as an inevitability. Something happens that is inevitable and it forces you to change. Someone gets a terminal disease. Something happens and I call inevitabilities eventualities of non-negotiability.
Okay.
This is going to eventuate,
yeah.
and it's not open to your negotiation. And so that forces you to change and forces you to surrender, which we're not. Surrender and be present. We're not real good at that. So I talk about it as an as an inevitability, as an event. Sometimes change is a big event. Someone flies a plane into a World Trade Center, and then the world's changed.
Yeah.
We all have massive events like that. We have minor events. Sometimes it is a process, but that's the most artificial and constructed version of change. Often it's an invitation. Someone invites you into a space and your world changes by virtue of that invitation. And sometimes it's a revelation. You wake up and see the world. The diamond is twisted. You've seen another aspect of it. Something else has been shone into your light, and you're never going to be the same because you just can't see the world. Once you've seen, you can't unsee. So I talk about those 5 aspects of change, and I talk about. I frame that within a conversation where so much of the conversation about change to date has been how do we manage, lead and control change. Whereas I think that change is the agent for transformation in our life. So
right.
we're not meant to control it. It's meant to control us. And so when we down weapons and down our fortifications and down our desire to dominate it, because when we try and dominate it, it hurts us. But when we surrender to it, it blesses us. So the book is about how do I confront these 5 faces of change in a surrendered and gentle way. So that's the heart of what it is.
Yeah, wow. When's that out?
In about a month. Okay. So
wow.
March.
Okay.
March of 2020.
Amazing. The other thing that's really exciting is over the years, how long have we been friends?
Getting close to 20 years.
The moments that change has happened, and when you've invited me into a change space, it's often been around food. It's often been walking the streets at night. It's often been over a glass of wine at the beach, but it's often been in your home. Driving here today, I often have a flashback to sitting in your kitchen eating a salad. You cooked some nice chicken on barbecue and a fresh salad, and just the conversation that I was invited into in your home changed my life. And so all these moments throughout our relationship. And so I've been pushing you for a long time to create some form around that so that other people could experience that as well. So super excited to hear that you created an opportunity for people to explore some of these wide open spaces that happen when you surrender the change. So tell us a bit about what's on the horizon for this year for you.
Well, so my wife and I have decided that we want to run a thing called Wide Open Space Experiences, which is a 3-month program starting with a kind of a retreat at the front end and a retreat at the back end, and intensive coaching all the way through, and then time for people to come and spend a couple of days with Ange and I, come and live with us for a few days and just one-on-one, just spend some great time together. And the heart of that is really about people starting to come back to, wherever they're stuck, wherever their world has become narrow. I mean, the opposite of a wide open space is a narrow constricted space. And a lot of people that we run into are just in that narrow aperture. Their life has become a narrow lane, driven hard. And it takes an immense amount of energy to stay in that narrow space. And so what we want to do is get them intuitively in touch with their authentic self again. Who am I? Not what do I do, but who am I? Who am I as a being, and why am I here? How do I allow myself to be the manifestation of God that I'm meant to be, rather than this narrow space? How do I have that wide open experience where, we don't just come out of our heads, but we start to come out of that subtle levels of consciousness, that subtle awareness of who we're meant to be and what we're meant to do, eventually what we're meant to do. But you don't get there just by being cognitively driven. You get that by resonance, by trusting,
sure.
by all those kind of more subtle pieces.
Yeah, and I think that's a big distinction around the modalities that we operate in. I'm much more in the cognitive space and a really rational, thought-through approach to dealing with change. But you're really focusing on intuition. And
100%. Focusing on, if you were a Christian, you would say, focusing on spiritual formation, your connection to God. If you're not in the Christian family, then mindfulness, meditation, subtle levels of consciousness, different levels of consciousness. So whereas you work really well with CBT, the cognitive behavioural therapy stuff, helping people with their story, pushing through that, having resourceful stories, I'm going to leave that to you, and I'm going to occupy that place where people develop a practice, get that connection back again, and start to live out of that connection.
Yeah, the intuition piece is what I think is super exciting, because the conversation we're having on the lounge before we recorded was a deeply intuitive one. You could sense that there was some intuition that I hadn't articulated, was avoiding, but was deeply authentic, and you pushed into that.
Always do.
You always do, exactly.
Always do.
And it's both painful and confronting and life-giving and transformation.
Totally.
So...
we do that. We both do that for each other, which is the kind of lovely.
Sure, but I've learned that
friendship.
from you.
Yeah.
Well, definitely, that is who you are and what you do.
Thank
so, that's an exciting thing to be offering.
Thank you. Yeah, it'd be good. I enjoy it.
So we plan to have more conversations like these about these kind of subjects. I think that's a good place to leave the conversation for today. So if you found that useful, be really, really interested to hear your feedback about it. It's the first time I've run this kind of episode. I'll have in the show notes how you can find out more about Greg and what he's up to, and let you know when that book arrives. So we'll leave it there. Thanks again, Greg, and I hope you found that useful.